Every parent knows the routine: bath time, pajamas, and then that magical moment when you pull out a colorful storybook filled with princesses, talking animals, and happy endings. But what if I told you that the bedtime stories you're reading to your children were originally designed to terrify adults? The fairy tales we think we know, Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, they're not fairy tales at all. They're sanitized versions of medieval horror stories, true crime accounts, and survival guides wrapped in pretty packaging by Disney and the Brothers Grimm. Behind every once upon a time lies a documented disaster, a real murder, or a historical tragedy so brutal that communities turned them into cautionary tales to keep their children alive. The talking wolves? They were serial killers. The wicked stepmothers? They were actual poisoners. You're about to discover that your favorite childhood stories have body counts. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting fairy tales. They were documenting crime scenes. 1. The Pied Piper. It's June 26th, 1284, in the small German town of Hamelin. The sun is setting, families are preparing dinner, and suddenly every parent in town realizes the same horrifying truth. Their children are gone. Not just missing, gone, all of them. 130 kids between the ages 4 and 14 had simply vanished without a trace. The records are still there, carved into church windows, written in town chronicles, documented by medieval scribes who couldn't make sense of what they witnessed. The town of Hamelin kept meticulous records of this event because it was so catastrophic that it nearly destroyed their entire community overnight. What makes this even more chilling is that the original story had nothing to do with rats. That detail was added centuries later, probably to make the tale less terrifying for children. The earliest accounts just mention a mysterious stranger in colorful clothes who led the children away with some kind of music, and they were never seen again. Medieval chroniclers offered several theories. Some believed the children were recruited for a crusade and died on the journey. Others thought they were taken to populate new settlements in Eastern Europe, a common practice where young people were essentially kidnapped to colonize hostile territories. The most disturbing theory? Mass drowning in the nearby river, possibly during some kind of religious ritual gone wrong. But here's what makes historians' blood run cold: the precision of the date. Medieval people rarely recorded exact dates unless something absolutely earth-shattering happened. The fact that June 26th, 1284 was burned into their collective memory suggests this wasn't just another tragedy. It was something so unprecedented that it became the defining moment of their town's history. The aftermath was equally devastating. Hamelin's population crashed. Economic records show the town struggled for decades to recover. Marriage records reveal that many families simply packed up and left, unable to bear living in a place where their children had vanished into thin air. Even today, there's a street in Hamelin called Bungalossenstrasse, the street without drums, where local legend says no music is allowed to be played because that's the path the children took on their final walk out of town. The fairy tale we know sanitized one of medieval Germany's most documented mass disappearances into a story about pest control. 2. Little Red Riding Hood. In 1764, something began hunting the people of south-central France. It wasn't a fairy tale monster, it was real, it was massive, and over the course of 3 years, it would kill over 100 men, women, and children in the most brutal ways imaginable. The French called it La Bête du Gévaudan, the Beast of Gévaudan. Eyewitness accounts described a wolf-like creature the size of a calf, with reddish fur, a broad chest, and jaws powerful enough to decapitate a human being with one bite. But here's what made it truly terrifying. It hunted strategically. Unlike normal wolves that kill for food, this creature seemed to target lone travelers, especially women and children walking isolated paths through the forest. Sound familiar? The beast had a pattern. It would stalk victims for miles, wait for them to be completely alone, then attack with surgical precision, often going straight for the throat or head. Survivors described how it would stand on its hind legs like a man, how it seemed to study its prey before striking, and how it appeared to enjoy the terror it caused. King Louis XV was so disturbed by the reports that he sent his best hunters, offering massive rewards for the creature's capture. The attacks became international news. Entire regions lived in terror, afraid to let their children walk anywhere alone. But here's the part that connects directly to Little Red Riding Hood. The beast specifically targeted young girls carrying baskets of food to relatives. Multiple documented attacks involved girls between 8 and 16 years old who were walking forest paths to deliver bread, cheese, or medicine to grandparents or sick family members. Marie-Jeanne Vallée, age 19, fought off the beast with a spear when it attacked her while she was carrying food to her family. Her detailed testimony describes exactly the scenario we know from the fairy tale: a lone girl, a basket of food, a forest path, and a predator that seemed almost human in its cunning. The original versions of Little Red Riding Hood were far more graphic than Disney would have you believe. In Charles Perrault's 1697 version, the wolf tricks the girl into eating her own grandmother's flesh and drinking her blood before devouring her alive. There's no heroic woodsman, no happy ending, just death and consumption. You don't learn this in history classes out there. What's even more chilling is that wolf attacks were documented across medieval Europe for centuries. Church records from Germany, France, and Eastern Europe contain hundreds of accounts of wolves entering villages, dragging away children, and terrorizing communities. The big bad wolf wasn't a metaphor. It was a survival guide disguised as a story. Medieval parents used these tales to teach their daughters a brutal lesson. Never trust strangers, never walk alone, and always be suspicious of anyone who asks too many questions about where you're going. The fairy tale was a medieval Amber Alert system. 3. Hansel and Gretel. Between 1315 and 1322, Europe experienced what historians call the Great Famine, 7 years of crop failures, livestock death, and starvation so severe that it fundamentally changed medieval society. During this period, something unthinkable became routine. Parents walking their children deep into forests and leaving them there to die. This wasn't cruelty, this was mathematics. Medieval families had to make an impossible calculation. With grain prices skyrocketing by 800% and winter approaching, they could either watch their entire family starve slowly or sacrifice the youngest members so the adults and older children might survive until spring. Court records from across Europe document hundreds of cases of child abandonment during these famine years. The process was heartbreakingly systematic. Parents would tell their children they were going foraging or visiting relatives. They'd walk them miles from home, deep enough into the forest that the children couldn't find their way back. Then they'd leave them with whatever scraps of food they could spare, maybe some bread crusts or a few berries, and disappear while the children were sleeping or distracted. But here's where the Hansel and Gretel story gets its most disturbing details. The cannibalism wasn't fictional either. Medieval chronicles from this period document cases of parents eating their own children who had died of starvation. More horrifying still, there are recorded instances of strangers luring hungry children into their homes with promises of food, only to kill and eat them. Gingerbread House wasn't a fairy tale invention, it was a warning about predators who used food as bait during times of desperation. In some regions of Germany, authorities found evidence of what they called witch houses, isolated cottages where desperate adults had resorted to cannibalism. These weren't supernatural witches casting spells, they were starving people who had crossed the ultimate moral boundary to survive. The Brothers Grimm collected their version of Hansel and Gretel in early 19th century Germany, a region that had been devastated by repeated famines and the 30 Years' War. The story they recorded reflected generational trauma, the collective memory of times when parents had to choose between keeping their children alive and keeping themselves alive. But the most chilling detail in the original Grimm version is how matter-of-factly the parents discuss abandoning their children. There's no agonizing moral debate, no tears, no dramatic emotion. The father simply says they have no choice, and the stepmother agrees. This cold pragmatism reflects how normalized child abandonment had become during survival situations. Archaeological evidence supports these stories. Excavations of medieval forest sites have uncovered small graves containing the remains of children who died alone in the wilderness. Carbon dating places many of these burials during known famine periods, suggesting that child abandonment was far more common than historical records indicate. The trail of breadcrumbs that Hansel drops to find his way home, that detail comes from actual survival techniques that medieval children were taught. Parents would show their kids how to mark forest paths using whatever materials they had, bread, stones, broken twigs, just in case they ever got separated or lost. The fairy tale was a survival manual disguised as a cautionary story, teaching children how to navigate a world where even their parents might not be able to protect them. 4. Snow White. In 1533, a beautiful 16-year-old noblewoman named Margaret von Waldeck was found dead in her chambers, her body showing clear signs of poisoning. She had everything a fairy tale princess could want: wealth, beauty, noble birth, and a promising future. She also had something else: a stepmother who despised her, and a family fortune worth killing for. Margaret lived in the German region of Waldeck, where her family controlled vast mining operations. These weren't ordinary mines. They used child laborers, many of them so young and malnourished that locals called them the little people or dwarfs. The working conditions were so brutal that most of these children died before reaching adulthood, their bodies permanently stunted by malnutrition and toxic exposure. But here's where the story gets darker. Margareta had begun questioning her family's use of child labor. Court documents suggest she was planning to reform the mining operations, potentially costing her stepmother and half-brothers enormous profits. Within months of these discussions, she was dead. The autopsy, conducted by the court physician, concluded that Margaret had been systematically poisoned over several weeks, a method that would leave her weak, pale, and appearing to sleep for long periods before finally killing her. Sound familiar? Her stepmother, Katharina von Hatzfeld, had married Margaret's father primarily for financial gain and had already secured inheritance rights for her own children. With Margaret gone, the family fortune would be entirely under her control. But the most chilling detail wasn't discovered until centuries later. In the 1990s, researchers examining Margaret's preserved hair found traces of multiple toxic substances, arsenic, mercury, and other heavy metals that were commonly used as slow-acting poisons in medieval Germany. The concentration levels suggested deliberate, repeated administration over at least 6 weeks. The magic mirror element of the story may have originated from Margaret's real-life situation. Her stepmother was known to be obsessively vain and had commissioned multiple mirrors from Venetian craftsmen, an enormous expense that demonstrated both wealth and narcissism. Palace records show she spent more on mirrors and cosmetics than most noble families spent on food. The brothers Grimm collected their version of Snow White in the same German region where Margaret had lived, nearly 300 years later. Local oral traditions had kept her story alive, transforming the real-life murder into a cautionary tale about family betrayal and the dangers beautiful women faced from jealous relatives. Even more disturbing is what happened to Margaret's body after her death. Following medieval noble customs, she was displayed in an open coffin for several days to allow mourners to pay respects. But witnesses noted something strange. Despite being dead for days, she looked as if she were merely sleeping, her skin still pale but not decomposed. This sleeping death appearance was actually caused by the specific poisons used to kill her. Certain toxic combinations could preserve the body temporarily while causing a death that appeared peaceful and natural. The real Snow White wasn't awakened by a prince's kiss. She was murdered by her stepmother in a calculated plot to steal her inheritance, then displayed like a doll, while her killer inherited everything she had owned. The fairy tale transformed a documented case of family murder into a story about vanity and jealousy. But the core truth remained. Sometimes the people closest to you are the most dangerous. 5. Sleeping Beauty. In 1634, Italian poet Giambattista Basile published a collection of folk tales that would shock modern readers into silence. Among them was Sun, Moon, and Talia, the original version of Sleeping Beauty, and it contained no kiss, no romance, and no happy awakening. Instead, it documented something far more sinister that was happening to unconscious women across medieval Europe. Here's what actually happened in Basil's version. The princess falls into her enchanted sleep as a teenager. A king finds her body, and instead of trying to wake her with a kiss, he rapes her repeatedly while she's unconscious. She remains asleep through 9 months of pregnancy and only wakes up when one of her newborn twins accidentally sucks the splinter from her finger while trying to breastfeed. This wasn't Basile inventing a shocking plot twist. He was recording a story that reflected a horrifying reality of his time. Medieval medical texts document a condition they called sleeping sickness or cataleptic states, likely what we now recognize as catatonic episodes, severe depression, or neurological conditions that left patients unresponsive for weeks or months. Noble families would keep these afflicted daughters alive, hoping they would eventually recover. But court records from across Europe reveal what sometimes happened to these unconscious women. Servants, visitors, and even family members would sexually assault patients who couldn't resist or report the crimes. When these women became pregnant while unconscious, the pregnancies were often attributed to supernatural causes or divine intervention. The most documented case comes from 16th century France, where a noblewoman named Marguerite de Navarre recorded the story of a young woman who fell into a catatonic state after a traumatic event. She was cared for by nuns in a convent, but when she awoke months later, she was pregnant. The resulting investigation revealed that multiple men had assaulted her while she was unconscious, including clergy members who were supposed to be protecting her. What makes Basile's version even more disturbing is what happens after the princess wakes up. The king who raped her is already married, and when his wife discovers he has 2 secret children with an unconscious woman, she tries to have the children cooked and served to him as dinner. The princess only escapes death when the cook secretly substitutes animal meat instead. This cannibalistic revenge wasn't fantasy either. Medieval chronicles document multiple cases of wives murdering their husbands' illegitimate children, sometimes by poison, sometimes by more brutal methods. The legal system offered little protection for children born from adultery or assault. The spinning wheel curse element of later versions may have originated from real medical conditions. Ergot poisoning from contaminated grain could cause seizures, hallucinations, and extended periods of unconsciousness. Families might blame these episodes on curses or supernatural forces rather than acknowledging the medical reality. When Charles Perrault rewrote the story in 1697, he sanitized the rape into a romantic kiss and eliminated the cannibalistic revenge plot entirely. The Brothers Grimm sanitized it further, making the prince even more heroic and the awakening even more magical. But the original story was a warning disguised as entertainment. It taught medieval audiences that unconscious women were vulnerable to predators, that the men who claimed to rescue them might be the greatest danger of all, and that the consequences of these assaults could destroy entire families. The fairy tale transformation of rape into romance reveals how desperately later generations wanted to believe that unconscious women were safe, that powerful men were heroic, and that happy endings were possible even after the worst violations. The real Sleeping Beauty never consented to anything that happened to her. She was a victim who became a mother while unconscious, then spent the rest of the story trying to survive the consequences of crimes committed against her body while she couldn't fight back. I-6. Bluebeard. In 1440, French authorities arrested one of the wealthiest noblemen in Europe on charges so horrific that even medieval courts, accustomed to brutality, struggled to process the evidence. Gilles de Rais, a war hero who had fought alongside Joan of Arc, was accused of torturing, raping, and murdering over 140 children in his castle dungeons. The investigation that followed would inspire one of history's most terrifying fairy tales. Gilles de Rais wasn't just wealthy, he was obscenely rich, owning multiple castles, vast estates, and enough gold to fund private armies. He was also intelligent, charming, and devastatingly handsome. Exactly the kind of man parents would trust with their children. For over a decade, children had been disappearing from villages around his estates. Poor families would send their sons and daughters to work in his castles as servants, and the children would simply vanish. When desperate parents asked questions, they were told the children had been sent to other estates or had run away. The payments to families stopped, but so did all contact. The truth only emerged when one of de Rais's accomplices, Etienne Corriot, was caught trying to break into a church. Under torture, he confessed to helping his master murder dozens of children in ritualistic ceremonies that de Rais believed would grant him supernatural powers and unlimited wealth. The court testimony was so graphic that medieval chroniclers refused to record the details. But what they did document was de Rais's method. He would invite children into his private chambers, lock the doors, then torture them for hours before killing them. Their bodies were burned in massive fireplaces, and their ashes were scattered in his gardens. Here's what connects directly to Bluebeard. De Rais had multiple wives who died under mysterious circumstances. Each wife was given access to most of his castle, but forbidden from entering certain rooms. Court records show that at least 2 wives discovered evidence of his crimes and died shortly afterward. One from apparent poisoning, another from a suspicious fall down castle stairs. The original Bluebeard story, recorded by Charles Perrault in 1697, follows this exact pattern. A wealthy nobleman marries young women, gives them access to his entire house except for one locked room, then kills them when curiosity leads them to discover his secrets. The locked room contains the bodies of his previous wives, hanging like meat in a butcher shop. But Perrault's version sanitized the reality. De Rais wasn't just killing wives, he was murdering children. The forbidden room wasn't filled with adult women. It was a torture chamber filled with the remains of boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 16. The fairy tale transformed a documented case of mass child murder into a story about marital disobedience and female curiosity. But the core warning remained the same. Wealthy, powerful men who seem too good to be true probably are. What makes de Rais's case even more chilling is how long he operated without consequences. His wealth and political connections protected him for over a decade while he killed with impunity. Local authorities received complaints about missing children, but refused to investigate a war hero who had connections to the royal court. The investigation revealed that de Rais had developed elaborate rituals around his murders, believing that the more innocent the victim, the more supernatural power he would gain from their death. He specifically targeted children from poor families because he knew no one would demand justice for them. When he was finally executed in 1440, over 800 families came forward claiming their children had disappeared after going to work in his castles. The actual death toll was probably much higher than the 140 documented cases, since many rural families never reported missing children to authorities. The Bluebeard fairy tale served as a warning system, teaching generations of women to be suspicious of men who offered too much too quickly, who isolated them from their families, and who maintained secrets that could get them killed. But it also revealed an uncomfortable truth about medieval society. The wealthy could literally get away with murder as long as they targeted the powerless. And even when justice finally came, it was often too late for hundreds of victims.